task, as we were saying, difficult and dangerous. Also because too easily the dedication and difficulty of this defense make it become excessive and not fully justified. As well as it's easy that bad intentions and egoistic or party interests appear to muddy and alter all actions' morality and responsibility. Good morning to everyone. I'm Pep and this is the Spanish Civil War. In this channel and for the next 3 years, we'll follow week by week the Spanish Civil War, its battles and the Holocaust that it provoked. This week we'll start by taking a look at a battle that has been raging for 1 month, or better put, a siege. As you may remember from the beginning of our series, 21st of July, we saw Colonel Moscardó in Toledo, who the 18th refused to send ammunition to Madrid, siding with the rebels. A column then was hastily sent from Madrid, and the rebels that initially had the control over the city had no other choice but to retreat to the Alcazar, which has become an impenetrable fortress. The numerous Republican assaults against the fortress failed utterly. The 800 defenders were able to keep the militias at bay because of their superior training and ammunition reserves. The 16th of August, the Republicans started digging a mine to blow the Alcazar from below. Meanwhile, they kept pressure. Last week, Commander Rojo entered the Alcazar to ask for its surrender. It was not accepted, but Moscardó asked for a priest that was allowed to enter the fortress in order to confess the defenders. This priest, Vázquez Camarasa, known for having left-wing sympathies, was left alive when the coup took place and the war started. But these same left-wing sympathies will force him into exile at the end of the conflict. At the beginning of this week, another attempt to force the surrender of the fortress was made by the Chilean ambassador, also without luck. The Alcazar, even as fortified as it was, had been damaged by the continuing artillery pounding. At the beginning of the month, the 2 north towers became useless, and this week, the 18th of September, the mines exploded, blowing up the southeast tower. After the explosion, a Republican full-scale attack takes place. According to Isdale, even a Great War Schneider tank took part in the assault. The Republican troops charged through the smoke and flying dart just to be mowed down by the tenacity of the defenders. As will happen in battles like Stalingrad or Monte Cassino, the destruction provoked by the attackers gave the defenders new hiding spots between the lines to fire from. The Republicans will continue pounding the fortress during the following days, until the 20th, when they tried to burn it down without success. That same night, Largo Caballero reached the battlefield and ordered the fortress to be taken within 24 hours. The rebels had taken Santa Olalla. They were just 40 kilometers away. In the south, Cape on one side and Varela on the other are expanding the rebel-controlled area. Ronda, Antequera and Peñarroya fall with the repression we are already used to. In the north, after the fall of Guipúzcoa, the week will see fighting in the area surrounding of the village of Legazpi. As the week reached the end, the village was evacuated, and on the 20th it will fall into rebel hands. On the Galician front, the slow but seemingly unstoppable advance of the Galician columns continues in order to relieve the besieged forces in Oviedo. At the beginning of the week, the Republicans were able to defend La Carboñana village, but the village will fall as well as Grado during the week. But the rebel forces will suffer at Peñaflor and also near Trubia. The problem for the Republican side was that they were already there. From Grado to Oviedo, there were just 24 kilometers. In the Balearic Islands, after the Catalan whale returned home, some reinforcements were sent to bolster the defenses of Eivissa, but to no avail. As at the end of the week, all the Balearic Islands, with the exception of Menorca, will be under the control of the rebels. The repression unleashed can be read in Bernanos, as said a week ago. Meanwhile, In the Catalan mainland, Fresquet Alegret, with his death squad, continues his tour. On the 13th, they murdered 45 people in Gandesa, and the 14th, 27 in Falset. Quoting the already dead journalist Josep Maria Planas, it was difficult to distinguish between idealistic revolutionary terror and plain criminality. This week, Francesc Alegret arrived at Reus, where the local committee was waiting for him, armed and ready to fire in order to avoid episodes like the ones in Gandesa and Falset. It's important to note that in most of the cases, the aggressions against a village or its patrimony were carried out by outsiders. It was difficult to see someone burning the church where the funeral of his grandfather took place, or where he was baptized. In Andalusia, as the African army advanced, most of the violence was provoked by refugees from other villages, in response of what was done to them. In a sort of ripple effect, they committed atrocities in the villages where they arrived. The case of the Fresquet Alegret death squad is the different one. That's why we wanted to talk about it, as they rumbled through Catalonia, bringing terror. But even there, in most of the cases, committees usually didn't harm the patrimony of the people of the village. They usually ask another committee to take charge of the situation, and in exchange, they will do the same in the other committee's village. To continue, we'll take a look now to the international stage, as two main events happen. The first is the second meeting of the Non-Intervention Committee. Okay, we already said last week what the committee was doing, or to be more explicit, what was not doing. So the news regarding this second meeting is that there are no remarkable news. Something more important happened the same day that politicians from the old continent met to warm their seats. A group of Spanish refugees was received by the Pope. The Pope made a very interesting speech. It was that interesting that at least one of the attendants, but probably more, was offended by what the Pope was saying. We have the Italian speech below, and we started our episode with the translation of one of the paragraphs that would never reach Spain during the war. In fact, apart from that explicit insinuation to the rebel excesses, at the end of the speech, the Pope, in what we could consider a Christian position, asked the refugees to love their Republican brothers. As we've said, the full Pope speech never reached Spain, at least during the war. The translated version that reached Spain had those parts with an explicit critique of the rebel actions suppressed. This falsification, made by the Pope's Catholic followers, had two main consequences for the rebels. With the critique towards them suppressed, the speech turned out to be the divine justification of their crusade. It appeared clear now to them, and for the ones that had still any doubt, that in the eyes of God, the war they were fighting was a just war. In a few days, we'll see together with the Pope's speech the publication of Play Daniel Pastoral Letter, The Two Cities, that, like San Agustin, contrasts the terrestrial city, the Republic, with the divine city, the rebels. On the other hand, the censored speech had also an effect on the Republic. As the original speech was not available, the Republic could now convince itself, if it had any doubt, that the Church was the enemy. So, also this had a side effect on the rebel side. Going for a while to the rear guard, during this month and until November, up to 10 Catalan columns will be sent to Madrid in order to strengthen the city defenses. From the beginning of the war until the 19th of September, from Catalonia and the Aragonese territories taken by the CCMA, more than 120 militia columns were created. A column was a self-sufficient unit that existed at least for more than one day. Each column was formed at least by one sentry, as usually a sentry was composed by 111 men plus one centurion, overall commander of the unit. These 111 men were divided into 10 groups of 10 men plus one group commander each. The columns had headquarters with professional soldiers as advisors. One of them, Captain Guarnier, will refer to the confusion and contradiction of a militia that understood they had to fight a war, but were against any traditional military organization. The biggest columns, like the Ruti column or Tarragona column, had their centuries merged into bigger clusters to improve their organization. It's important to note that not all of these 120 columns existed at the same time. For example, after the operations in Mallorca, the militiamen that took part in the landing joined or created new units. As time goes on, there will be a reduction of the numbers of columns, as there will be a tendency to merge. Initially, the columns were made up of volunteers of the different political parties or organizations. They easily lost their motivation as the struggle progressed. They didn't believe this would turn into a long and bloody war. The central government then started to pay a salary to those militiamen. And new recruits, motivated by the salary more than the revolution, started to pour into the militia's ranks. Apart from that, as stated by Orwell, among others, their military training was poor, if it existed at all, and there was a general lack of weapons. Meanwhile, some organizations like the CNTFA had plenty of weapons in hideouts as they didn't trust their partners. Just a small family digression here. During the 50s, my family started some renovations at home. Behind a wall, they found 60 Mausers, 2 Hotchkiss machine guns, some Naranjeros, a couple of bags full of explosives, and plenty of ammunition. So, even if the militias overpowered and outgunned the rebel counterparts in the Aragon front and also other fronts, it was this huge manpower merged with the big amount of weapons that remained in the rear guard that at the beginning of the war made this lack of weapons and equipment on the Republican side so clear. In order to help solving these rearguard problems, together with the omnious number of paseos, this week the Victory government will make the decision to create the Milicia de Vigilancia de Rereguardia, Rearguard Vigilance Militia, thus putting under control from the government the rearguard militias. We'll see that this control will take some time to become effective. Another decision from the recently created Victory government this week, also aimed at the rearguard, was a decree regarding the expropriation of the lands belonging to the people condemned by the people's courts, thus giving more legitimacy to the people's courts and embracing the actions most of them already had done. These popular courts popped out in Spanish Republican held zone like mushrooms during the first stages of the war. They were a substitute for the judicial power that had disappeared and were aimed to prevent, more than to provoke, the indiscriminate killings associated with the Red Terror. So now, as always, or as almost always, a couple of notes to end the week. First, since the 3rd, loyalist troops have been gathering around the sanctuary de la Cabeza. This Monday, the 14th, the siege officially begins. We'll cover it in more detail as it progresses. Second, Spain, at that time, still had a colony far away in Africa, Equatorial Guinea. The history of this colony is dramatic and interesting. You could ask Mary Hopkins about that. This week, the island of Fernando Po, even if a bit late, joins the rebel side. As we've said, the fate of that colony is very interesting, but it goes beyond the Spanish Civil War, as those were the days, my friend, of Spanish occupation. As always, if you missed last week's episode, here's the link. Please, don't forget to like the video and subscribe us. If you enjoyed it, share it. We have to bring light to the history of Spain. If you are able to support us in our Patreon channel, as these heroes already did, or offer us a coffee, this could also be great and would help us to carry on and improve the project. Let's make this possible together. Thanks for your attention. Goodbye and salute.